Hey everyone, so the room looks a lot bigger from the front, so bear with me, I'm a little bit nervous. But so my name is Adriana Laurent, and I'm a fourth-year international student in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems, and I'm here to talk to you about climate justice. So climate justice is the intersection between social justice and climate change, and how the most marginalized communities all over the world, both on a local and global level, will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. So I'm a member of an organization called Love Intersections. So we're a group of queer, hopeful millennials who are also people of color who believe that storytelling is a powerful agent of change. And we want to talk about these really sticky and difficult social justice issues through a lens of personal connection. So I'm going to tell you a story. So I'm from Honduras, in the coast of Central America, from a city called La Ceiba. Now, a lot of people don't know where that is, so I got you. And I grew up on the coast of the Caribbean, so a total Caribeña, and it was like absolutely awesome growing up here. I had the beach, I had the mountains, it was like a tropical Vancouver. But Honduras is in a hurricane-prone part of the world, so I have definitely felt the impacts of climate change in my home country. In 1999, Hurricane Mitch hit the coast of Honduras. I was only about 4 or 5 years old at that point, so I don't remember much, but the first memory I ever had was fear, because I didn't understand the severity of the situation. I was only 4, so I didn't know what a hurricane was or what the impacts of a hurricane would have on my home country and on my community. I remember that my whole family was preparing for this hurricane. We all went to go get groceries, we got food, water, a bunch of batteries to make it through the hurricane. And we all went to my grandmother's house because she had the biggest and sturdiest house. So we were super prepared for this hurricane. And my family, especially my parents, they kept telling me, oh, the eye of the hurricane is coming soon, the eye of the hurricane, we need to be ready. And I had no idea what that meant. So that night I had a dream that the eye of the hurricane was like this tornado instead of a hurricane, because that's what I had imagined as a 4-year-old. And the eye of the hurricane had like this snake eye, and it had decided to personally torment my family and I. So I imagined that the hurricane was just like out to get us. So that's how I imagined a hurricane. But here are some of the impacts. So this is an image of a fallen bridge. There were about 160 fallen bridges all over the country, and 2 of those bridges fell in my home city, in La Ceiba. A fallen bridge isn't just a matter of faulty infrastructure. It's disconnecting communities at a time like this. So imagine that you're in the middle of this hurricane and your family is on one end of the city and you're in the other. It's 1998, so there's not that much internet, and you can't call people because the calls are down. So you can't go to the other side of the city and see if your family's okay, to see if they're even alive at that point. Another impact was there was a lot of severe flooding. So this is an image of the flooding in a rural area. And one of the unforeseen consequences of this was disease. So there was a spread of malaria and dengue and cholera. And all of these illnesses can actually be fatal for children under the age of 5. Altogether, there were about 10,000 to 15,000 people who died from Hurricane Mitch. This makes Hurricane Mitch the deadliest hurricane in the last 200 years. And about 1 million people were displaced during this time as well. This is a newspaper article that came out after the hurricane. It says, "Desastre en La Ceiba," and that's my home. So there was about $5 billion in infrastructure loss and just overall damage in the region. And our president at that time, Carlos Flores, he reached out to the international community for aid. And he said what took 50 years to build was destroyed in 72 hours. It only took 3 days to devastate an entire country, an entire region. 60% of our population is under the poverty line. So, and most of these people depend on agriculture for survival. And as you can see in the image before, there was a lot of devastation due to flooding in rural areas. And that's why we can't talk about the impacts of climate change without talking about privilege. And at this point, I'd also like to acknowledge my own privilege in the situation, because my family was privileged enough to get food, to get water, and to have a house that wouldn't fall down during the hurricane. So it's super important to keep that in mind. And the people who were mostly impacted by Hurricane Mitch were Black communities, Indigenous communities, and impoverished communities. And that general rule applies everywhere in the world, including countries like Canada. Indigenous people in Canada are disproportionately impacted by climate change, and they are fighting back. The Idle No More movement is a movement for Indigenous people to fight for their sovereignty, to fight for their land and water rights. They are at the forefront of the environmental protection movement, and we have so much to learn from them when it comes to living sustainably and in harmony with our environment. They are fighting against major projects like the Kinder Morgan pipeline. The proposed Kinder Morgan pipeline route actually goes through Indigenous territories, and they are fighting super hard against the Kinder Morgan pipeline. And we have so much to learn from them. This is an image of the 2017 Atlantic hurricane season. And this is to keep in mind that this is happening all over the world. The latest example of this was Puerto Rico, and some parts of Puerto Rico still don't have electricity. So let's keep in mind how big the scope of the problem is. My story is just one of millions, and my story is also one of privilege. But the impacts of climate change are also being felt in our own backyard. So this is the 2017 BC forest fires, and they had devastating impacts all over the region, especially in Indigenous communities. So it displaced about 65,000 people, and it burned about 1.2 million hectares of land. So it had a severe impact. So how exactly are climate change and social justice related? So climate change will accentuate existing stressors in marginalized communities. It'll deepen the struggle of those who are already struggling with issues like poverty and food insecurity, who already have insecure housing. And it's not to say that all of the world's problems are caused because of climate change, but instead how these pre-existing conditions of inequality will interact with the severe impacts of climate change on these marginalized communities. Now let's take it back to Honduras as an example. Like I said, about 60% of our population was under the poverty line at that time, and many of these people were farmers in rural areas. Many of them lost their crop yield for the year because of all the flooding. They didn't have enough to feed their families anymore. And it caused a lot of displacement, about 1 million people in the region. And many of these people moved from rural areas to urban areas for survival, so that they could make ends meet, so they could have enough food to feed their families and enough safe drinking water. But unfortunately, a lot of urban areas were unable to accommodate for this migration because there was already this existing poverty all over the country, and because of the loss in infrastructure because of the hurricane. So it was very difficult for urban areas to accommodate as well. So imagine that you are a rural farmer in Honduras at this time, and you're already struggling to make ends meet, and then bam, you have a hurricane. And then now suddenly you lost your crop yields, one of your kids may have malaria, and the hospital is flooded, so you can't go there, and you can't eat anymore. So you have to move. Migration is the only option. So climate change and social justice have a bit of a mutually reinforcing relationship. So you already have these pre-existing conditions that make you vulnerable to impacts like climate change. And then when you have a hurricane, for example, that makes you even more vulnerable than you were to begin with. So it accentuates the existing conditions you had before. And this can also be seen on a global level. So these are the top 10 per capita emitters for greenhouse gases. As you can see, Canada and the US are at the top. Now this map depicts the Climate Change Vulnerability Index for 2012, so it's a little outdated still, but still applicable. And you can see that the countries who have the light green area are the ones who are at lowest risk for climate change vulnerability. And the ones who are in dark blue are the ones who are at extreme risk for climate change vulnerability. And now I've put the top 5 emitters for per capita emissions in greenhouse gases. And it's not a perfect relationship, but you can definitely see the trend. And I think that it's a bit of a cruel reality to realize that the countries who are at lowest risk for climate change vulnerability and who have actually benefited from fossil fuel extraction are the ones who are least vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And the countries who are least responsible for climate change are the ones who bear the heavy burden. a lot of parts of the world will actually become uninhabitable for human beings, especially in consideration with the existing conditions, the socio-economic conditions that they're already suffering from, in combination with the impacts of climate change, which heightens their vulnerability. So they will have no choice, often, but to leave. If you think of things like desertification or sea level rise or increases in temperature, which make it much harder for farmers to farm and maintain their families. So the only form of survival and the only form of adaptation to climate change for some people is migration. Which brings me to climate migrants. So climate migration and internally displaced peoples will be an increasingly important topic in the future. There's going to be more and more people moving around the world, moving around our countries even, in order to adapt to climate change, to this changing environment. Some statistics for you. Since 2008, about 26.4 million people per year have been displaced by natural disasters. If you do the math, that's a little bit less than one person per second. And if I finish my TED Talk in exactly 15 minutes, that's about 900 people that will have been displaced by natural disasters at that time. And currently, there is a policy vacuum in the international community to address the issues regarding climate migration. At the moment, there is no international agreement on what will be done regarding climate migration. And we need to do something about this because clearly the issue is important and it's happening right now. So what now? So this can be a really depressing issue to think about because it's not just climate change and it's not just social justice issues like poverty. Both of these issues are super complex to deal with in and of themselves. But when you combine the two, it's super overwhelming and super depressing. But there is definitely hope. We definitely have to keep that positivity. So there are a lot of awesome Indigenous organizations in Canada that are working to fight climate change. One of them, for example, is Raven. And they're focused on being an Indigenous legal defense fund. So they're the ones who are supporting Indigenous communities in court fighting against the Kinder Morgan pipeline. There is the Indigenous Climate Action Movement, and they are focused on centering Indigenous voices in the climate action movement and the creation of climate policy. This is super important to do because we need to center the voices of the marginalized communities who are suffering from climate change. And even on a UBC level, there's so many awesome initiatives you can get involved. There's so many things you can do, and so many great clubs and individuals that are working towards this. I'm a part of a group called the UBC Sustainability Collective. So we are focused on advocating for bold climate action and making sure that UBC stays accountable for the things that they said they would do. The most important thing to do is to get involved as much as you can. One of the quick and easy things you can do is to engage in terms of your civic engagement, because we need to keep our politicians and our governments accountable for the promises they made and ensure that we push further for more action, because we are not doing enough as is. So it's important to get involved at whatever level you can get involved. It's essential for our generation to take action and to take action now if we want to create a sustainable, just, and livable planet for all people. Thank you. And just a quick shameless pitch. We're actually hosting an event, the Sustainability Collective. We're hosting the event, the Sustainability Town Hall. So it's going to be next Tuesday, if I'm not mistaken. It's on the March 6th from 3 to 7 at the Nest. So come through if you want to know more about this. Thank you.